Launa has been a member of the Concord-Carlisle League of Women Voters since 2008, joining shortly after retiring from a 35-year career as an elementary school educator and principal. Launa's work with the League spans local, state, and national levels. As a member of the LWVMA Legislative Action Committee since 2009, Launa has focused on money and politics and climate change and energy. In early 2017, Launa helped form and co-chaired the LWVMA Committee for Environmental Action and Advocacy, EAAC, with a League colleague. The mission of the committee is to inform and engage members across the state on critical environmental issues and policies impacting Massachusetts, and to support and promote the transition to clean, renewable energy and environmental policy through legislation and local action. Launa also serves as an executive committee member of the newly formed LWVUS Climate Emergency Task Force, a team with the same mission dedicated to working with state and local leagues across the country. Please put your questions for Launa into the Q&A. Enter them at any time. We'll be asking them at the conclusion of Launa's talk. And now let's hear from Launa herself.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much, League and Amherst League and Friends, for inviting me to share some of the legislative climate and energy priorities for the State League this session. I have provided a document that has links to a lot of the material that I'll be referencing tonight, and you're going to be able to see that in your chat. It will be included with the link to the recording when that gets sent out to you all at a later time. So I would I'm gonna start my video right now. Hang on, my PowerPoint. Great. Okay, can everyone see the first slide? I'm gonna guess there's a silent virtual yes, and signal me please if you can't see anything. But I wanted to mention that as I began to develop this presentation, I adjusted the title a bit to Getting to Zero Emissions, because that's really where we have to go. And I believe that what I'll be sharing with you tonight are some ways that we will get to that path forward. But before I launch the actual presentation, I want to share a couple of events for you that are related. They're League-sponsored events. So here's the first one. And this one, whoops, that was a quick switch. This is about the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which I'll be talking about later in the presentation. This is a League-sponsored event, sponsored by the Leagues of Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, and co-sponsored by the organizations that you see below, including the relatively newly formed League of Women Voters of the U.S. Climate Interest Group Transportation Team, which I co-chair with a colleague, Sharon Brownfield from Stowe. So you should have been receiving information about this and a subscription or a registration link. So you may be interested in tuning in on that one. And then another is a much more local and down-home thing from the legislative, not the legislative, but the State League Environmental Action and Advocacy Committee that Karen Price and I still co-chair. It's still going. I'm very happy to say, and we have arranged for a webinar on May 24th at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and our speakers are going to be John Rogers, who is a senior analyst for, I want to get this right, senior energy analyst for the Union of Concerned Scientists, and Deborah Donovan, who is a senior policy advocate and Massachusetts director of the Acadia Center. So these, I think, are two very good events that you might be interested in tuning into. The 24th event with John Rogers and Deborah Donovan is about the Next Generation Climate Law, which finally, after a long, hard road, was signed by the governor back in March. So let me continue. So moving along with the presentation. As I mentioned, it's titled Getting to Zero Emissions, the Path Forward. So here's a slide about how we're doing, frankly. Let me get that out of the way. So the charts on this slide reflect global emissions, and this is from 2020, this information. So I'm trying to get this out of the way. The reality is that emissions are still rising. You can see in that top chart the direction of emissions. And the reality is that they are continuing to add. Our rising emissions are continuing to add to atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases that will last for decades in our atmosphere. And we continue to get reports that estimates of warming and sea level rise have been significantly underestimated. A 2020, and the slide below, that's the really critical one, is how to get to, the steep decline that we have to start with as soon as we possibly can is shown in the bottom slide. And it's, as you can see, a very steep path down. So a 2020 production gap report that was produced by leading research institutions in collaboration with the UN Environment Program reveals that the world, in order to maintain a 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, which is the goal at this point, and by the way, we're currently at 1.2 degrees, fossil fuel production needs to reduce by 6% per year over the next decade and beyond. And this is just to mitigate climate change, the worst impacts of climate change, not stop it. Instead, at this point, countries are planning an average annual 2% increase in fossil fuel production. The scientific consensus is that we need to act at a speed, scale, and scope that matches the urgency of the situation. This is truly an all hands on deck moment. While action at every level of government and society is important, coherent, coordinated state, national, and global policies are critical to success in dealing with this global crisis. In summary, the trajectory I just shared with you needs to change quickly and broadly across all sectors of the global economy and society. The need for this radical shift is urgent. Business as usual, as shown in this graphic, leads us over a very steep cliff. So, these are the tools that we have currently in our toolbox to get ourselves down to zero as quickly as we can if we implement these tools and use them. The necessary reductions are doable. We need to be perfectly clear on that. We can do this. The means are not the problem. It is our will and commitment to do the job in the time that's still available to us. And that relates to leadership, politics, and communication with the public. There is some good news. Addressing climate change is now on the agenda of a growing number of countries, including our own. We're in a unique moment in time in terms of awareness and concern about climate change across the globe and the public. And here in the US, we now have a federal administration that is working hard to address the issue with an all-of-government approach, the only way to make the significant progress that we need to make as quickly as possible. So Massachusetts has stepped up finally with one of the most ambitious climate agendas of all states after a long dry spell of no or inadequate measures from the legislature and the executive branch. And I wanted to be able to say the most ambitious climate agenda, and that was the case until I believe last week when Washington State came out with an even stronger and more ambitious climate plan. But still, we're very much in the top leading states in terms of our climate agenda at this point. So while my focus is on Massachusetts for this presentation, I'm talking about these other efforts and sort of the global picture because we need to keep in mind the interplay that now exists between state, regional, and federal levels. So how do we know these tools are actually workable, that they'll do what they need to do? Well, I'm going to show you a few examples because I think they are incredibly inspiring. And we need a little optimism and information about what we can do that will really work to accomplish what needs to be accomplished. This is a fuzzy photo, sorry about that, of the King Open Cambridge and Cambridge Street Upper School campus. It opened actually in late October 2019, so it's in play right now. It includes an elementary school, middle school, school district offices, a public library branch, a community swimming pool, and preschool and after-school programs. The buildings total 273 square feet, sitting on roughly 4 acres of land in Cambridge. This project incorporates several features designed to reduce or eliminate the use of fossil fuels as much as possible. And those features include 3,516 photovoltaic panels mounted on the roofs and facades of the buildings on the campus, 190 geothermal wells that were dug on site as part of the complex's heating and cooling system, and a rainwater reclamation system. When I think about geothermal, I'm going to be talking about a bill that the League has prioritized that does talk about geothermal and tries to move geothermal further in our state. I get really excited. I mean, this is a renewable energy source that is right under our feet, and we can access it to do so much of what we need to do. This is actually a photo that was taken in 2016. It's a photograph of the Block Island, the Rhode Island Block Island wind farm, offshore wind farm installation that is now operational, I believe as is 2018. The reason I want to mention this is that Gina Raimondo, who is now the Secretary of the Interior in the Biden administration, was the governor who made this come to pass. And it's a very significant installation and demonstration that you can have these large wind farms, offshore wind farms, and not disrupt the fishing industry and other water-based interests in the region. So it really did demonstrate that, and it is very important for that reason. Some of you may have heard about Vineyard Wind. In a good way. It was just granted final approval by the Departments of the Interior and Commerce this week. Vineyard Wind is the first large-scale wind farm off of Martha's Vineyard, and it signals a major shift in the clean energy landscape. The project is going to cost about $2.8 billion. It's known as Vineyard Wind 1. This project is going to consist of 62 turbines spaced about a mile apart. This is just a photo that I thought was kind of representative. It's obviously Vineyard Wind has not yet been installed. But anyway, the turbines are going to be spaced about a mile apart. Each one will stand about 837 feet above the water's surface. Cables buried beneath the ocean floor are going to connect to power from these turbines with the New England grid onshore. The project is expected to produce enough renewable electricity to power 400,000 homes in Massachusetts every year, while also saving ratepayers billions of dollars and reducing annual carbon dioxide emissions in the state by about 1.7 million metric tons. And I'm sure that many of you have heard about the automobile manufacturers and their pledges to stop producing internal combustion engine gasoline powered vehicles by anywhere from the 2030 to 2035 or so timeline. And that is just a very exciting thing. We've got to do more than electrify vehicles to deal with our transportation system, but at least reducing the emissions from vehicles, which represent a huge portion of the emissions load in our New England region, is critically important. And also very important to this effort is the fact that more than 100 companies, organizations, and jurisdictions have pledged to work with the Northeast Electric Vehicle Network to support electric vehicle adoption. So how do things stand and where do they stand here in Massachusetts? Well, these are some not so fun facts about the Massachusetts legislature that I wanted to share with you. In the last session, 9,678 bills were filed. 530 were passed and sent to the governor. Only 93 of those 530 were considered substantive. The rest of them related to things like home rule petitions, sick leave bank, individual retirement benefits, or land taking. 5% of bills filed are actually passed. About 1% of bills filed and passed are substantive bills. So we're not only dealing with addressing climate change and other pressing issues, we're dealing with a legislative structure and culture that really is critical to what we do from this point on. In Massachusetts, I don't think it's a secret to any of you that the legislature went from doing very little for a long time, with important comprehensive legislation held up in the House and notable tension between the House, the two chambers, the House and the Senate. And very, well, I won't say quickly, but in about 2.5 years, 3 years, the mood changed, the action changed, the perspective changed, so that now we have a really wonderful comprehensive law and greater collaboration and compromise between the House, the Senate, and the executive branch. I can only speculate about why this has occurred, this shift has occurred. And this is what I'm going to attribute it to, but understand it's my opinion only. We now have a more unified and committed community of advocates on the need for significant action, and they're willing to lobby their legislators intelligently, politely, and appropriately, frankly, around the need to act. I think that what I've seen in working with many of the advocacy groups in the state for the last 11 years is that there's more of a sort of circling around some key legislation, and that's extremely important. There's also the issue of the increasing global awareness of the threat that we all face. There's a change in House leadership. This is not to be underestimated. There was concern about would we go from not so great to even worse or what? And many of us have been just quite pleased to see Speaker Mariano's advocacy and support of some very important legislation. And we also have pretty ambitious executive support and leadership on a regional level. And for that, as well as state level, the regional level is the Transportation and Climate Initiative that I'll be talking about a little bit more. And at the state level, we have the 2050 Decarbonization Plan and a 2030 Interim Clean Energy and Climate Plan. I don't think that we should dismiss or diminish in any way the impact of support and pending policy that's now coming from the Biden administration. So it seems that the Biden jobs bill and infrastructure bill is going to pass one way or another, and that all states are going to be beneficiaries of that when it happens. So given the statistics I just shared regarding the number of significant bills processed by the legislature, and given the urgency of the climate change reality, I feel that we really have to aim for bills and policy that are comprehensive and don't just tinker around the edges. We have to adopt that same all of government approach taken by the Biden administration and echoed in the new Massachusetts climate law. We need to focus on bills and executive policies that have system change as the intended outcome and that include systematic implementation and goal checks that are going to move us as quickly and as broadly and as thoughtfully as possible at the local, state, and regional level, with built-in time checks and measurement of progress so that we can make needed adjustments as we move along. Where we are today with technology and some of our tools is not going to be where we are in 2030, 2040, and certainly not 2050. We don't want to wait until 2049 and discover that we haven't made the progress that we've needed to make. So I'm very pleased to report that the new climate law, as well as the Biden executive law, which is tied very tightly now to the climate law, include those kinds of checks along the way to make sure we're staying on the path that we need to be on. So I want to talk a teeny bit about regional and state action. I've talked about it, mentioned it a couple of times so far in the presentation. I think one of the biggest, really most important regional initiatives is the Transportation and Climate Initiative Plan. It's expected to be implemented by 2022. It has been in the works for several years now. The League has been a strong supporter of TCI for at least 3 years. And Massachusetts has been an absolute leader with advancing the Transportation and Climate Initiative in the region. So Governor Baker has really supported this bill from the get-go, and that's very important to have leadership from him throughout the region. Another important bill, well, I just want to say a teeny bit more about the TCI because it's in play right now. The TCI-P is a regional collaboration of 13 Northeast and Mid-Atlantic jurisdictions that seek to reduce carbon emissions in the transportation sector, the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in our region. It's responsible for approximately 40 to 43% of emissions. The TCI advocacy community includes top environment, energy, and transportation officials, as well as political, legislator, and governors, working together to collaboratively to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, minimize the transportation system's reliance on high carbon fuels, promote sustainable growth, and address the huge challenges of vehicle miles traveled and environmental justice. And I want to make special note of the importance of environmental justice, climate justice, and making sure that we are factoring in the impacts and the important voices of those who live in environmental justice in overburdened communities. I've been working at the State House on bills for about 11 years now, and I have to say I've never seen the level of awareness and attention that is now factored into what we're doing, both within the legislative end and the executive branch. So I think that's really important. I want to say that one of the issues with the transport, well, let's see, no, I'll get to that later, sorry. Also, in December of 2020, the administration released the Massachusetts 2050 Decarbonization Roadmap and the 2030 Interim Clean Energy and Climate Plan. And the roadmap was designed to set mandatory targets for emissions reductions so that we could get to net zero by 2050. Many of the features of the 2050 Decarbonization Roadmap were worked with in the new climate law and strengthened, actually. One of the essential changes that was made in the bill, when it was a bill, and went to Governor Baker's desk the second time, went to his desk 3 times, but the second time he basically worked with his staff to improve and strengthen the language around environmental justice communities. So that has been maintained in the new bill, the new law rather, and that's a very important piece of this. And I want to mention the 2030 Clean Energy and Climate Plan is actually the implementation arm of the Decarbonization Roadmap. It's the 2030 Clean Energy and Climate Plan that is going to hold the actual specific strategies that will be used to help us get where we need to get. So that is a critical thing. It is actually under construction now. The administration released the interim plan and was accepting public comments, and a lot of advocacy groups were involved in submitting comments. The League participated in some of the comments that were submitted. So we're all waiting to see just what we end up with in the 2030 Clean Energy and Climate Plan when it finally becomes finalized. So all the bills that are of interest to the League, not just climate and energy, but I think you all know the scope of the issues that the League is involved with and concerned about. They are all on a web page on the LWVMA website that is linked. You can link to it via the homepage. So I just wanted to show you kind of what it looks like. If you go to up at the top in red, lwvma.org, that'll get you to the homepage. You look for the advocacy tab. There's a pull down menu, and in that tab, you'll see the bills that we've prioritized for legislative action, either support or opposition, are listed under there for 21 and 22. So that is where you go for that. And this is what you would see if you were to look today or tomorrow. Now, I want to tell you that the legislative specialists have been working really hard to improve the information that we're making available to our membership. And I'm going to give you a little sneak preview of what it's going to look like by showing you a little piece of the work I'm doing on my bills. So what the new website is going to show is, in addition to testimony, which we've always linked to on that page, we're going to be showing summaries, bill summaries, sort of like this, fact sheets, letters to the legislature, and additional information about the bills that we think are going to help you as advocates. So we hope that we'd love your feedback on this. We're working really hard to make this as user-friendly as possible. So we hope to hear from you that it is helpful. I think one of the things we were asked to include, and it was a great idea, was where in impact on issues or where we stand, the state version of our positions. People wanted to know what positions supported the various bills that we were advocating for or against. So we've included the specific sections of impact on issues or where we stand, so that people would know that and can rest assured that everything we're advocating for is in fact supported by lead positions. So now to some of the bills. So again, this is going to be a very high level view, but I wanted to share it with you. This first bill is an act relative to building energy and decarbonization. Why is this bill important? It's important because emissions from our built environment buildings are right behind, in terms of emissions load, right behind transportation. So this is a critical area. It's been one that people, it's been a hard bullet to deal with because of what it involves and what it will involve. But the beauty of this bill is that it offers ways to start dealing with this in a productive and cost-sensitive way. So in terms of what it does, one of the most critical things it amends the state Mass Save program to include appropriate support for underserved communities. So that's a new thing. For new construction, it defines net zero building. It incorporates new stretch code performance standards that would be that are actually established by 2025, and that would go and become the base code by 2028. It amends the boarding of building regulations and standards to include in its mission climate, public health, equity, and policies to meet state 2050 roadmap emissions targets. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about when I talk about all of government. We've got to get every agency involved in this fight, basically. And that's kind of an example of that in actual practice. So this is a really important bill. For existing buildings, because new construction is one thing, but we've got a lot of built stock. So for existing buildings, this bill would support deep energy retrofits programs through the Department of Energy Resources that would be funded by a trust fund. It establishes a net zero task force under the Department of Energy Resources to support new performance standards and energy retrofit programs. And in terms of transitioning off fossil fuels, this bill would amend it's a loan program called, the acronym is PACE. It stands for the Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy Program. And that program currently includes funding for gas lines and adds clean energy, but now it would remove those subsidies or funding for gas lines. But what it will add is clean energy eligible applications, so that we can start shifting, not continuing to perpetuate fossil fuels, but to really start to move to support and facilitate implementation of renewable energy. And it would also amend the Mass Save program to begin to phase out funding for fossil fuel systems. So when I dealt with Mass Save in my home, in our residence, it was all about changing light bulbs. If they checked and assessed your heating system and they found it to be a high efficient gas burner or whatever, it was okay. You know, there was nothing you would have to do, and then it was just a question of the individual owner deciding they wanted to shift to a different system. But now it is going to basically support and encourage adoption of non-fossil fuel-based energy sources within your home. So that is an important shift as well. We're not perpetuating the old. Another bill is an act relative to transportation and environmental justice. This bill relates to the Regional Transportation and Climate Program Agreement. So the Memorandum of Understanding that was signed in December by 4 jurisdictions, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and DC, provides the program's framework, but it leaves key implementation decisions to the states because every state has a different set of circumstances and considerations they have to factor into their TCI program implementation plan. And for example, in Massachusetts, Governor Baker can enact this program without the legislature. Connecticut and Rhode Island, however, do need legislative support for this. And they're currently, this is why we're doing the May 20th event with Connecticut and Rhode Island, is because we want league members to be involved and the public to be aware of what's happening there with regard to the need to pass legislation, critical legislation, to actually being able to implement a significant and meaningful transportation and climate initiative in their states. So this bill creates a transportation and climate initiative trust fund, which is going to fund investments in clean transportation, improve public transit, walking and biking infrastructure, and other projects to support transportation justice and cleaner air. Very important provision is that it raises the minimum amount of revenue going to communities that suffer disproportionately from climate impacts and transportation pollution from 35%, which is the base minimum that's in the Memorandum of Understanding. Our bill increases that amount to 70% of revenue flowing to those communities and those needs. It defines the roles and membership of a TCI Equity Advisory Board that will represent overburdened and underserved populations from across the Commonwealth, and that will help shape the program's implementation and inform investment decisions and make sure that we've got the voice of the environmental justice communities reflected in what happens here. So again, revenue is going to be used to expand or modernize public transportation infrastructure and fleets, electrification of public transportation fleets, EV charging infrastructure, alternative transportation methods, complete streets, dedicated bus lanes, bike paths, micro-mobility and pedestrian walkways, minimize transportation costs for low and moderate income individuals and families, and ensure first and last mile connection to public transit. Enact Achieving a Green Future with Infrastructure and Workforce Investments is a new market-based, it's a bill that incorporates significantly a market-based mechanism. You may know that the League has been in support of carbon pricing pollution for a long time, and we've not had great success with that in the Massachusetts legislature, and so this is another bite of that particular apple. And what is really interesting about this bill is that it really is looking at workforce investments, and the funding source would be bonds. And bonds are a really excellent way for jurisdictions to fund capital improvements. And that is a piece that was taken out of former Speaker DeLeo's Greenworks bill, the notion of using a bond to help fund some of this and allow money to flow to some of these communities. So I think it's a really good bill. We're looking forward to some success. When I first wrote it up for consideration by the legislative action specialists, legislative action team, we had over 60 sponsors at that point. So that was a really good start for this bill. And this is a bill that I'm extremely excited by. I hope that you will understand why when I talk about it. This bill is an act relative to the future of heat in the Commonwealth. And the future of heat, and I have this highlighted, allows gas utilities to switch from gas distribution utilities to distributors of renewable clean energy using networked geothermal heat. I've been working in a coalition that's been developing this whole approach of geothermal microdistricts. It is very exciting. One of the big issues that always looms is the threat that the fossil fuel industries and the gas utilities feel whenever we talk about increasing renewable energy. So this is a way that allows the utilities to continue to operate. It continues to support workers in that utility. It's a retraining effort, and the retraining isn't enormous because it's simply substituting the leaky gas pipes that the gas utilities have been replacing and charging ratepayers for with pipes that will be used to distribute heat from the ground underneath our feet in a closed loop system that will gradually, hopefully, replace fossil fuel energy sources for heating and cooling. So the exciting thing is that gas companies are currently piloting or planning a pilot demonstration of installations to develop this decarbonized infrastructure, which we're calling networked geothermal distribution. I know that's a lot, but that's kind of where we are with that one. And let's see, back to this. So in addition to those bills, which are supported and actually on the webpage now, we also have, I have some refiled bills and a pending bill that I'm very interested, at least one. And the refiled bills are the 100% clean energy bill, which has been updated. The updated bottle bill, the league was involved with the original legislation around a bottle bill, and we've been trying to update it so that it reflects the new sort of family of beverage containers that have come about over the last 20 or 30 years. So that bill is something that we will continue to support. And the third refiled bill is about producer responsibility for paper and packaging. I don't know about you, but I've been astounded at the amount of packaging that seems to be involved with everything that we purchase. And this is a bill to get the producers of the paper and the packaging that they put their products into to really think about how they can reduce that amount of non-recyclable material. And we've already seen some of the companies beginning to do that, but this is an effort to get them more engaged in that in a significant way. The bill that I have not submitted yet for consideration is an act to promote offshore wind energy and renewables. It is very exciting what's happening around wind now. We've got the wind behind our backs on this one, so to speak. And this is a bill that would just help move that effort even further along. So I also want to say that I'm not the only specialist working on environmental and climate and energy bills. I wanted to just give some special notice to my cohort and my colleagues on this portfolio from the legislative specialist team. Carolyn Lee, who is working on water resources, pest management, invasive species, PFAS, biomass and public lands, and Tanya Roy, who works with me on transportation, but she is focused more on public transit and now currently incentives for zero emission vehicles. So that is the team. I am not going to speak to their specific bills because that's not for me to do. This could be another webinar for you all. But just wanted you to know that there are three of us at least working on environmental and climate bills in the state. And it's a great team. I'm very, very happy to be part of such a really good team. So what can we do as individuals, as league members? I would like to tell you that I hear over and over again how important the involvement of the league is in various coalitions and in working on these bills, because the league is not your usual suspect. We are not an environmental group per se. We are a multi-issue, good government organization that works on behalf of the public interest and welfare. And that's part of the reason why we cover this huge, broad scope of issues as a league. So when you contact your representatives as a league member, they tend to listen a lot more carefully. We do our homework. We have been around for over 100 years as of this year, and we're highly respected at the State House. So the league really matters. And we also really matter in terms of being a vehicle for public education in our communities at the local level. It's extremely important. So what would I recommend that you all do? For one thing, continue lobbying your representatives at the state and the congressional level. You know, we had Ed Markey and other congressional representatives working on the biomass issue here. That's important. They have influence within our state legislative system and our executive branch. Make sure that when you do candidate forums, you are including questions about the candidates' commitments and understanding of climate action and the laws that are in place now. You know, this is not just wishful thinking. We now have laws in place that we're trying to achieve certain targets that are codified in law. So we have to pay attention to this, and we have to expect our officials at the local level to understand that this is a law and that we all need to be engaged in this. Another interesting thing that I think maybe some of you do, maybe not, some of you may well be involved in creating local community climate action plans, but make sure that if your town or municipality does have a climate action plan, that the plans are in line with the new laws and targets and policies. And if they're not, you need to advocate to update them. The last bullet is persist, but actually there's one more bullet before persist that I did not add. And that is when you get an action alert from the state league, please look at it. Because when we send those action alerts, we try not to overwhelm you guys with action alerts. But when we do send them, it's because they're coming at a time when additional support through your advocacy is really, really important. So that's what I have to say tonight so far. And I want to thank you all for, again, for the invitation to present and for your attention. And just thank you very much.
Thank you, Launa. Thank you for your very informative and thoughtful remarks. And thank you for all the work you've been doing over the past decade plus to help get us to a better future, all of us in our world. So please, it's time for questions, and we have a few questions already, but be sure to write your questions in the Q&A. And our other question, I'll be asking Launa some of the questions, and the other person asking questions is Cynthia Brubaker, and I believe she has a question to ask.
Yes, the first question. As we transition to electric vehicles and HVAC updates, how do we make sure that we are not consuming more and more fossil fuels during this transition?
Well, I think for one thing, we have to do everything we can to promote some of these new approaches and strategies that we're trying to get in place. So are you actually asking about increase in vehicle miles traveled?
This was a question that was sent in, and that was just how it was phrased. So I'm not sure the intent.
I'm going to try and stop I'm going to stop my sharing so that I can see this a little bit more clearly. There, how's that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to see if I can. We can't guarantee that everyone's going to do what they're supposed to do, but the point is that we're going to have in place a lot of incentives and financial revenue dedicated towards making these tools much more available to people. I think the interesting thing is that converting and transitioning off of fossil fuel to renewable energy sources, the cost of renewables has come way, way down. It's really a money saver, and certainly will continue to be that. We have to talk about these approaches. We have to make sure that people know. For example, I'm looking at getting an induction stovetop, getting off gas. I have gas heat in the house. We're looking at a residential geothermal system for our home, because technology has just changed dramatically, and it's much easier to do now than digging deep wells to do that. So that's at the individual level, but there are going to be state incentives and federal incentives that are going to support all these efforts. So people need to be aware. I think the league can play a very important part in that, in terms of helping the public be aware of what's available. I think it's a very exciting time, frankly. It's a little scary, but there's a lot of excitement.
Thank you.
One of the questions recently asked is whether this is going to be available on our website, and the answer to that is yes. We're going to have, we've recorded this presentation, and Launa is sending us her slides. So you definitely will be able to see this again if you'd like to, and tell people who missed it and would like to see it that it'll be at the league website, LWVMA.org.
Thank you, Susan.
Cynthia, another question?
You have another question here you haven't mentioned anything about, but there was a question, somebody wanted to know if there were any bills that we can advocate for that address dark sky initiatives.
Well, I'm not aware of a bill that's out there. There maybe the person who wrote that is aware of a bill like that. That is currently not part of the bills that we are covering through the league specialist pool. But if there is a bill like that, that's a really important initiative. I know I can't remember the names of the cities, but I believe just recently I heard that several cities are really trying to implement that and turning off, city lights, etc., to help the migratory progression of birds. Very, very important. We are in a place where we're losing a lot of species, and we don't want to do that. We certainly don't want to do it through lighting the skies at night.
Okay, thanks.
Launa, you alluded to the influence or the influence of the gas industry. Yes. And the fact that it's helpful that they now have a program that will enable them to use cleaner fuels. Could you talk a little bit more about the influence of industry and getting bills prevented from being passed or passed?
Well, one of the really interesting features here is while we have Eversource and National Grid agreeing through a lot of conversation and discussion to start pilot programs and with geothermal microdistricts in mind. And I will tell you that this is not like new radical technology. Using geothermal heat has been around for a long time. What's novel about this is doing it at utility scale. And there was an incredible report that was done by Bureau Happold that was funded by the Barr Foundation, that it was a feasibility study of the whole notion of geothermal microdistricts. And they presented they looked at and analyzed various scenarios for that. So that was a big part of helping get the gas utilities on board. While I'm saying this, I'm so glad you raised this because as you noted in my introduction, I used to work on money in politics, and I still do, but not quite in the same way. The gas utilities, at the same time that they are talking about their desire and interest in moving forward, there was a recent conference with the gas utility heads where they talked about renewable energy being a massive threat to the industry. And we do have a lot of evidence of the utilities continuing to fight in a variety of ways. I don't know if you heard about what happened in Cambridge recently, but the gas utilities distributed booklets in schools, in public schools, that basically talked about the virtues of gas as a quote natural gas. I will add that the gas utilities are the ones who added natural as an adjective in front of gas, hoping that some of the aura of natural would rub off on gas. I guess you could make a case that it is quote a natural substance, but it is not harmless. And there are more and more reports that are coming out. In fact, one of the webinars we want to do on the EAAC is on the reports around the health impacts of gas in your homes as well as in the streets. We know about Merrimack Valley and explosions, but even within our homes, if you have a gas stove, they apparently emit very toxic kinds of chemicals. It's related to asthma in kids. I'm not trying to be, a fearmonger here, but that happens to be the case. So what happened in Cambridge, just to sort of, I don't know what the end of that story is, but parents were very upset about those booklets because they were the parents who are aware of what the issues are around gas were quite upset that was allowed to be distributed in the schools. So I'm not sure what the Cambridge public school system will be doing about this, but they're continuing to fight it. And we know the long history of disinformation that has come from the oil industry and the fossil fuel industry. So we have to be aware. I mean, it's like trust but verify. We've really got to stay on top of this all along the way. The gas companies, Eversource and National Grid, have committed to doing these pilot demonstrations. So now we just have to hold them to that. What is it? It's a proposal to get approval from the DPU was submitted, and comments, we were allowed to submit comments. And the organization, Gas Leaks Allies, has been leading the fight around, or the campaign to make this shift. And they submitted some very thorough and important kinds of considerations for DPU to take into effect and for the gas utilities to modify, Eversource in this case, to modify with regard to its plan. So that's the kind, it requires constant vigilance.
I have kind of a follow-up question on geothermal. Someone wrote a question in asking, where can we find out more about this in our own communities? What's being done, and whether, where are these pilot programs and so forth?
I can send you information about that. I can't really, I'm not prepared to give it to you right now, but I will certainly give you a little packet of links and information around it. So the geothermal microdistricts, I mentioned with that King School in Cambridge, that they had 196 wells. So that has been the sort of standard way of tapping ground source energy for heating and cooling. The closed loop system, the microdistrict system that's being proposed now and has been analyzed and shows that, it can, we know that it can work. Okay, now we want to see how it actually works in actual use, right? Implementation. That's the point of the pilot programs. So those do not require wells. So we don't really have that in place at this point, but these pilot programs are a way to start to use them by the gas utilities. And the reason, I mean, I can pursue residential geothermal that is a shallow kinds of closed loop piping system. The reason it's so important to the utilities is not only because it can keep them going, because basically they're going to become a stranded asset, but also because for ratepayers, for us, what is happening is that we are being charged for the replacement of leaky gas pipes that is amortized until 2050. So we could potentially be paying for these gas pipelines that are going to be totally, stranded assets within, I would hope 10 years, but maybe 20 years, but we're going to have to continue to pay for that. So what this new approach allows for is, again, instead of the work, the trenches are already there. Instead of doing the work of installing gas pipelines that are going to be stranded, replace those with the pipes for geothermal, right? Which do not leak, or if they did leak, it's only water, right? And some kind of a solvent solution, but they're meant to be closed loop, which means they're not free flowing. If they leak, you just plug the leak. It's not like a gas leak. So it's important to us for that reason. Why would we want to pay for a utility and a product that is going to be no longer viable in hopefully a relatively short time? So anyway, I will send you information about geothermal. There was a great I'm going to send a video from this old house, which was working at the residential level. It's a company called Dandelion. They have perfected this shallow closed loop geothermal system. They're going to be moving to Massachusetts. So I'm going to be a big supporter of residential geothermal. But the microdistrict obviously is dealing with a whole street, a whole neighborhood. I believe they're looking at a district in the Merrimack Valley, which makes a lot of sense given what happened there 2 years ago with the explosions. But they were also looking for other sites. And I can send information around communities that may want to try to get in on a pilot program.
Thank you.
I think that was too much information, but anyway.
No, I was trying to think how we could disseminate that information because we've got people online tonight from different leagues. Well, we'll work on that so that, because that might have come from another league, that question actually. We'll get the information out. Could I ask another question?
Sure.
Susan's taking care of her cat.
Yes.
I wanted to know, we had a question earlier about helping municipalities with planning and getting all of this done, getting ready for retrofitting. It seems like this is a major undertaking. How we can be involved in that if we can, and what kind of funds are there that are going to help municipalities pay for this?
Right. So if we get some of the bills through that I discussed tonight, the funding is going to be there. We're also expecting funding for, I know you should not, you need to get it before you start planning with money that you haven't received yet, but it seems very likely that there will be funds that will be flowing to the states and then into local communities. And certainly the bills that I talked about that are Massachusetts based all talk about revenue. We talked about bonding, bonds for the revenues and stuff. So that's going to be happening. The most important thing, I'm just going to say this, I am surprised. I haven't spoken with every municipality in the state, but I've spoken with representatives from several. And there is a tremendous lack of awareness about the climate law, about what's happening in DC with regard to the infrastructure bill and the executive branch stuff. I actually had a conversation with my representatives asking them to please approach the Baker administration and say, you guys have got to get information out to the municipalities about what's coming down the pike. They need to get on board. I believe it was the Cambridge school. The reason that plan, that school was built was because they had a climate plan that reflected getting to zero emissions by 2050, and they're taking it seriously. It's not just a plan that's sitting on a shelf. So that's the other piece. That's why I'm urging league members to find out if you have a climate plan for your community. And if you do, does it really reflect where we are today and where we need to go? And if it doesn't, there need to be some updates. I also feel very strongly that the Baker administration has a big responsibility in communicating this to the municipalities. So you can mention that to your representatives when you call them.
Thanks. Okay. Susan?
Thinking that we should probably be thinking about wrapping up because we've reached the hour of 8. And we haven't been able to ask all the questions that we have received. Cynthia, do you have one more question that you'd like to ask?
Yeah, I guess I'd like to ask you, not so much an open-ended question, but specific things that leagues can do course, we're kind of out here in Western Mass. We have slightly different issues going on. But what we could do either in a collaboration in Western Mass with the leagues or individually in our own leagues to work on this issue to make sure that the climate plan gets, the planning gets done and the funding comes in and the work is moving along as it should.
Right.
Just a call to action. What would you recommend?
Well, I would recommend that we work together as much as we can. For example, the 20th event about TCI, basically I reached out to the league leadership in Connecticut and Rhode Island, and they were once they heard about what we were trying to do, they were immediately on board and very, very supportive. And now within 2 weeks, we were able to turn around and get a webinar that is going to be involving state officials from their states. We set out the plan, we prepared the webinar. They are basically contacting directly some of their state representatives, tremendous power in working together. And if we could do like, sort of think regionally around the leagues, if you can connect, you just have to reach out to leagues and say, we're interested in working on this. Are you interested in this as well? Could we do something together? And then, if you just contact the state office, me, maybe Carolyn, anyway, the legislative specialist, we could talk with you about what the resources are that are available that could support this. But I really feel when I said all hands on deck, I meant all hands on deck. We've got to get as many people involved. And I think having a united group with a pretty clear, clean message is extremely important, particularly for an area like Western Mass. You do have different issues there. And we understand that.
Thank you, Launa. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your very informative and interesting talk. And it's about such a crucial matter, and we hope that we all will follow through as you're suggesting. Thank you, audience, and I do apologize to you that we weren't able to answer all the questions that you've asked. We unfortunately have run out of time. I want to thank my fellow panelist, Cynthia Brubaker, for helping with the questions, and above all, to thank our host, our invisible webinar host, Kathy Smith-Campbell, who has served above and beyond and is ready to take a 2-week break before her next hosting event. So thank you all for participating. Thank you for joining us. Remember, the recording will be available on the League of Women Voters Amherst website. Thank you, audience. Thank you, Launa. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Kathy, and have a pleasant evening, everyone.